Hi, everyone. Here we have the second of these recorded lectures. This is for week 9. And this week we'll largely be talking about the manufacture of desire. We already have two really good thought pieces. Ella is taking on Lynn Layton's piece about the divisions of the subject, and Kai has been writing about Bourdieu and symbolic power. And so in today's lecture, I'm really going to focus on Deleuze and Guattari's work, and then a little bit of Deleuze as well in Control Society. And we'll pick up Layton and more of Bourdieu when we talk tomorrow in the seminar. So as I've done in the past, and I'll make this section a little bit shorter than some of the others, I do want to talk a little bit about the biographies of Deleuze and Guattari. And I think this is interesting because it shows how people come together. As I've said in the past, I think it's interesting for us to think about these philosophers and theorists as real people that have arguments, that get along, that fall out, that come together. And for us to think of how these people influence one another, and to think about some of the contradictions perhaps in their own lives. And hopefully this gives you some more insight into who these people are. I recognize that last week I went on a little bit long, and I went on so long, and then I realized that I didn't even say perhaps the most important bit about Rosa Luxemburg's life. Actually, sorry, her most important part of her life is her thought and her revolutionary activity and her contributions through her writings. But the idea that she died in January 1919, she didn't just die. I mean, she was murdered by fascists or people who would become associated with fascism in the form of the Freikorps, the Free Corps, these kind of right-wing reactionary political units that were trying to stymie revolutionary socialist communist uprisings that were happening in Germany at the time. So we turn then from where we left off last week with Marcuse writing in One-Dimensional Man about radical desublimation and the process by which, say, what looks like freedom actually becomes the expansion of the market. So removing a taboo suddenly becomes a way of transforming that which was taboo into something much more mainstream and part of the economy. And the example we talked a little bit about, but maybe we can bring this up as well this week, is to think about the transformation of how society reacts to homosexuality. And I think this will be quite important to the conversation this week because of positions that Deleuze and Guattari themselves and Foucault themselves take, to think about the radical possibilities of homosexuality in and of itself as a way of challenging heteronormativity. As an example of radical desublimation, we actually see through the transformation of the legalization of gay marriage that not only is gay sex no longer taboo, but actually it gets transformed into its own kind of heteronormativity, whereby marriage and the procreation in the sense of adoption or having other people's children via surrogate suddenly becomes the way of normalcy, and that gay people look like everybody else, which is a great thing. And it's important that gay people are not oppressed and repressed, that they aren't forced to go to jail or to be forced sterilized, as Alan Turing faced in the 1950s when homosexuality was illegal here in Britain. People facing embarrassing publication of their photographs and their names in the newspapers because they were arrested for having gay sex. It's important that that's been liberated, but it's also interesting to see what in the 1950s and the 1960s this potential of emancipation through gay sex suddenly is gone. And then perhaps we can talk about this as well, the way then that corporations use gay pride parades as advertising. That suddenly we can talk about rainbow washing, if you will, that these giant corporations want to be seen as supporting gay rights, and yet what they really are doing is advertising themselves. And so seeing radical desublimation in this way from Marcuse, I think, is important for what we're going to talk about this week in terms of manufacturing desire from Deleuze and Guattari, particularly through their two-volume collection called Anti-Oedipus, and their two-volume collection of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, and we'll be talking largely about the first volume, or about one volume, and that is Anti-Oedipus. So let me just say a couple words about these figures, because their lives intertwine, and I think their positions are also important to understand what some of their writing is. And Guattari, Felix Guattari, is a very interesting person. I'd like to start with him. Born in 1930, and he died in 1992. He was a self-described militant by the time he was 16. He went to go study philosophy at the Sorbonne and decided to drop out, that philosophy in the university wasn't radical enough for him. And so he did a radical step, and that is he went to go study with Jacques Lacan, the very famous French psychoanalyst. And so he was trained, analyzed, and then trained by Lacan. And then he joined Jean Horry, who was also a Lacanian student and also analyzed by Lacan, at Le Bourg. And Le Bourg was an experimental psychiatric institute, a very important and interesting space, because at Le Bourg they decided to suspend the analyst-analysand kind of binary, and to create something much more in favor of group therapy. That the ethos at Le Bourg was that the analyst-analysand was always a hierarchy. And so to somehow move into a group setting was of greater equality. And if you remember way back at the beginning, this is much like Sándor Ferenczi's notion of mutual therapy, this idea that the group can participate in its own analysis, and that it's not the analyst who has the answers and the analysand the questions, but rather that the group can help one another see and reflect on the issues that each person is bringing to the group. So part of this is an eye to complex interactions. And I think this will be quite important as we go on for the next few weeks. Moreover, I would say it's really unfettered by social convention. So it really is the potential of the group. It's not that the group is sick. It's rather that the group has come together in order to become better or to become well. You'll see in a moment, even those terms are problematic for Guattari, but that the group itself can come together and assist one another. Here, I think it's quite important that we understand this is almost what we'll see later from Jacques Rancière. This is almost its own kind of dissensus. It's about breaking the consensus of the social convention. It's about the potentiality of the group to help itself, as if the group can help itself. It simply does. It doesn't need to be authorized. It is self-authorizing. And this is really at the key of Guattari's politics. This idea of kind of self-authorization is quite important. From 1955 to 1965, Guattari was the editor of The Communist Way, La Voix communiste. But this is also interesting. It was a Trotskyite magazine paper, and Guattari was very much in favor of the Italian autonomists, these kind of Marxists that are more like anarchists, right? So they follow a lot of the writing of Marx, but they don't see the party as being at the forefront. And this is key to Guattari's politics. It follows on, right, Luxemburg's politics of saying the revolution is spontaneous, that people are equal, and that the party does not have the answers. And this is quite important. In 1970, the Guattari founded the Center for the Study and Research of Institutional Formation, l'étude et recherche formationnelle institutionnelle, and there he really tries to explore how institutions themselves form and the role that they play in politics. And here, institutions not just being kind of bodies, physical bodies, but institutions of practice, and very much in the kind of Gramscian way of thinking about institutions. And here we might see some of the themes emerging. He founded a journal, he and others together founded a journal that was connected to the center, just called Research. And in Researches, and this is in 1973, in 1977, Guattari was actually brought to trial, found guilty, and fined for committing the crime of committing an outrage to public decency by publishing an entire issue of research on homosexuality. That even in France, even in 1977, right, someone like Guattari could be found guilty of a crime, right, just for discussing homosexuality. Now, actually, I apologize. I just recognized in my notes. I'm sorry. This was in 1973 that he was found guilty and went on trial. In 1977, he founded another center, the Center for an initiative into new spaces of liberty. So the Centre d'Initiative pour Nouveau Espace de Liberté. And Sinel really becomes a focus of kind of green politics. He sees politics, revolutionary politics of the proletariat, as being connected to ecological politics. And so very much at the forefront of kind of green liberation or green left movements. And he continued to write, and we'll talk more about those writings in just a moment, and he continued to write in his partnership with Deleuze, Guy Deleuze, until he died of a heart attack while actually still working in Labor in August of 1992. So he was doing what he loved, he was with his patients, and I think actually to think about the potentiality in Labor, not just that it's a group therapy, but at this center, the patients themselves actually participate in running the facility, right? So that the patients aren't sent there, but rather they are part of the institution itself, that they help shape the decisions and help shape the therapy and help shape the interactions. This is very much committed then to a undoing of the kind of politics that Michel Foucault describes in terms of making bodies docile in the factory, in school, and most importantly, for Foucault, in the asylum. Right, that the prison and the asylum are places that mark bodies. And here Labor tries to create a different kind of space. Perhaps, very importantly, Guattari seeks Deleuze out after the May 1968 student uprising, this potential of, say, workers and students coming together to reshape politics. And I think this idea of the politics of 68 cannot be, say, underestimated. So much was happening that year. I mean, 68 is this incredible year of potential where we see kind of people trying to change socialism in Czechoslovakia, what was called the Prague Spring, the idea of throwing off the mantle of socialism from the Soviet Union, communist brutality that still had the mark of Stalinism, to create what Alexander Dubček called socialism with a human face. To think about the potential of socialism in an emancipatory fashion, rather than what it seemed to have become, which is another form of oppression. But there were other movements that we see in London, we see in Berlin, we see all over Europe, other places following student uprisings that started in Italy, particularly in Rome, and then moved to Paris in May of 1968, where the students take to the streets demanding, right, more freedom, more autonomy, greater amounts of ability to create their own curriculums, to be able to create their own learning, to be participants, to not be lectured at, and particularly to try to disentangle the educational system from the military-industrial complex, to stop, right, universities from participating in the oppression of colonized people around the world. In France in particular, to see the responsibility that the universities had, right, in the oppression of Algeria and other places that were former colonies in the French Empire. The students say, we don't want to have any part of that. And then seeing the way that the universities create management structures that oppress the workers, and suddenly we see then workers coming out to support the students, and there is this potentiality of students and workers coming together. Likewise, in the United States, in August of 1968, we see young people demanding, right, the end of the Vietnam War, not just, say, by protesting the war, but demanding that the Democratic Party actually nominate someone who is against the war, to no longer support, right, Johnson's war in Vietnam, that is basically a killing machine, both of the Vietnamese and of young American men. Perhaps you know, those protests devolved into a police riot, what the government, the U.S. government, a congressional commission that looked into what had happened in August of 1968 in Chicago, called a police riot, where the mayor of Chicago, Richard J. Daley, sent out the police and basically said to the police, remove those hippies from my park. And the police did that with great brutality, billy clubs and tear gas. Unfortunately, that would repeat yet again. Also in 1968, students came out in advance of the Summer Olympic Games being held in Mexico City to likewise demand greater autonomy, to likewise demand greater influence and the end of repression, and also in this case to end the support of the United States in all kinds of commercial ventures. Here, the party of the Institution of Revolution, the PRI, that's a contradiction, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, sent out military troops to quiet the protesters, and many of those troops opened fire on students that were at the autonomous university protesting their government and were killed. The official death count is 300 students, but it is well understood that probably more than 1,000 students were killed by the police. So the radical Guattari seeks out a writing partner, someone who understands philosophy, that goes back to Guattari's interest in philosophy when he originally went to the Sorbonne, but just found it too oppressive. And he finds that person. He knows of Deleuze, and so he reaches out to Deleuze, and they start a friendship, a partnership that then will last until both of their deaths. So Deleuze is older than Guattari. Deleuze born in 1925. He will commit suicide in 1995, and that was largely because he suffered from tuberculosis in 1968, and he had to have a lung removed. And by the time he was much older, by the time the 1990s came around, he had incredible breathing difficulties. He was incapable of doing the smallest activities, including he even found writing arduous. And with the death of his friend, Félix Guattari, in 1992, Deleuze fell into a great depression and felt that he just could not go on. Excuse me. And they write this book, Anti-Oedipus, together in 1972. They write 1,000 Plateaus in 1980. They write together What is Philosophy in 1991, one of their last pieces. But They also have a lot in common. Deleuze goes to the Sorbonne in 1944 to study philosophy, and he is taught very rigorous philosophy. And he actually has a lot of love for classical philosophy, a way that perhaps Guattari just didn't have the patience for it. But I think there's something about Deleuze knowing and being trained in classical philosophy that he's able then, like Picasso, who was trained as a classical painter, who was an amazing classical painter, a kind of prodigy. If you actually see some of the paintings that Picasso makes as a teenager, I mean, they rival Velázquez, right? But they are in that style of Velázquez, and you can't imagine that that's the same Picasso, right, who's going to make such abstract things. But in many regards, it's because he can do that, paint like Velázquez, that he can then become the painter that he is. And perhaps we can understand Deleuze that way too, that he can become the philosopher that he is because of his training. Right, so he finishes in 1948, teaches at a number of lyceum. He kind of bounces around. He calls the period between 1953 and 1962 a, quote, hole in his life. He basically writes his master's thesis under the supervision of Jean Hippolyte. And he really starts to decide, yes, he wants to become an academic. And so he writes his doctoral état, the famous book, Difference and Repetition. Perhaps we can talk about that a little bit. And this really, grounds him. And so he gets a position at the University of Lyon. He had been teaching kind of in a temporary way at the University of Paris. The 68 comes. The Communist Party actually backs de Gaulle's call for an election, for a parliamentary solution to what's happening in the streets. And it's at this point that it's clear, right, that the Communist Party itself is actually afraid of a revolution from below, is afraid of the students. Can you imagine that the Communist Party is afraid of the students? And it's here that Deleuze turns his back on the Communist Party of France. And it's at the same moment that Guattari seeks him out, and they create this new partnership. In many ways, one could actually see that it's Guattari's militancy that shapes Deleuze rather than the other way around. So even though it's Guattari who's the psychoanalyst and Deleuze the philosopher, it's the radical psychoanalyst who probably radicalizes or makes more militant the philosopher than the other way around, that the clinician is actually probably the more radical. And in this, right, Guattari is also bringing that experience from the board, which is we can do this ourselves. This can be a revolutionary philosophy. The potential is there. We just have to realize it. And this starts to become the basis of their writing partnership. Now, in some regards, these different potentials, I think, are about seeing the world in a different way. And so I want to say a couple things about the title of the book, and then we'll go dive into the book. But this is about capitalism and schizophrenia as the title of the book. And in a way, it's about seeing differently through what they will call, Deleuze and Guattari, schizoid analysis, right? To think about how psychoanalysis may itself participate in repression. And so how do we undo that? And part of that is just seeing the world differently. They are not advocating schizophrenia, right? So it's clear. And Guattari even says this directly. Schizophrenia, right? The schizophrenic is sick, right? It is a sickness. But thinking about how to think differently, that becomes part of the issue here. So let's think about what being that, say, unbound by social convention, what does that allow? So in a way, it's about thinking, for them, transcendental unconsciousness, a kind of social, historical, natural unconsciousness all at once, right? We'll talk more about what it means to become a body without organs, but they suggest to become a body without organs, right? It's that you walk on your head, you sing with your sinuses, right? You see through your skin, you breathe through your stomach, right? That we think about what does it mean to see through the skin, to not just feel? How can we be receptive in different ways? They claim that the psychoanalyst says, stop and find yourself. And they say, no, let's go further. Let's go forward until we become a body without organs. Let's be, right, the hypochondriacal body. Let's be the paranoid body. Let's be the schizoid body. Let's be the drugged body. Let's be the masochistic body and see what it feels like. And then we can decide what we want. Don't deny ourselves these experiences. And so in this sense, it's not to say, let's become the hypochondriacal body, let's become the schizophrenic body and stop. It's not that. It's just how can we think about thinking of our experiences differently. Now, the two of them, right, are also friends with Michel Foucault. And I think this is important when we see the introduction to the book. It's by Michel Foucault. And they see a lot in common. And I would just say in the end of this kind of presentation of their biography, their paths cross, that there is the creation of a new institution, a new university that's founded in response to what had happened in 1969. The University of Vincennes is founded. It becomes Paris 8, so the 8th campus of the University of Paris. And Foucault is made the chair of the philosophy department there. And so he recommends that they hire Deleuze. So Deleuze and Foucault are in the philosophy department together at Paris 8, and they're fast friends, the three of them, Deleuze, Guattari, and Foucault. They go on vacations together. They're quite good friends. The Paris 8 had an incredible reputation of being radical. It still has a reputation of being quite radical. Now they moved the campus to Saint-Denis. And if you know Paris, right, this is a workers' suburb. Saint-Denis has many people from immigrant backgrounds, some in third and fourth generations of immigrant backgrounds. But it's a very working class, very complex, religious, ethnic, racial, linguistic, complex neighborhood. And so it's fitting that that this radical educational institution was there. But perhaps it's worth noting, right, that Foucault, who says that the school makes a docile body, is the chair of the philosophy department at a campus in the University of Paris. Just a small, teeny story about the place, though. It was quite interesting. They lost their accreditation for a very short period of time because another member of the staff there in the philosophy department, which was Judith Miller, who was the daughter of Lacan. And so Judith Miller was actually good friends with Guattari and therefore friends with Deleuze as well in the department. Although I'll say just a quick thing about that in just a moment. But she just thought that this place was potentially just way too conventional. And so the department lost its accreditation because Judith Miller was basically giving university credit to anyone she met on the bus, and basically said that the institution was the same old institution for capitalism, and that she was trying to make it function as poorly as possible, trying to really gum up the works in kind of a famous, kind of Luddite tradition of, trying to stop the gears by throwing, your spanner into the works. She was let go, and the philosophy department went on. So, but it is worth saying, right, that they were trying to really live a radical life and to make what they to make real what they were writing about. Unfortunately, Deleuze and Foucault fell out in 1977, and they fell out over the treatment of Klaus Croissant, who was the attorney for Andreas Baader, the Baader-Meinhof group, or the Red Army faction, the anti-capitalist terrorist organization in West Germany. And Foucault said he was simply unwilling to accept the terrorism and blood of the Red Army faction. And Deleuze disagreed and said, I mean, if you want to fight capitalism and fight the violence of the capitalist system, then it might be important that there is some violence. And moreover, this is about whether Klaus Croissant should defend Andreas Baader, and they disagreed. This actually drove Deleuze and Guattari to write in 1977. So while this fight is going on, about the violence of the capitalist system itself, and whether revolutionary movements need to counter the violence of capitalism with more violence. And this goes back to the question we had from Rosa Luxemburg. Although it's interesting because just a year later, Foucault went to Iran to report on the revolution there as a reporter for Soirée de la Serra. And there it was clear that, because it's kind of difficult to remember, well, you remember, you may not know, the outcome of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 is not at all clear. I mean, as the revolution is starting to gain momentum in 1978, there is as great a potential that the Iranian Revolution is going to be a Marxist revolution as there is that it's going to be an Islamic revolution. And one of my dear friends who grew up in Tehran, I mean, she was out in the streets fighting to overthrow the Shah, and the Islamists were there to overthrow the Shah. And it's difficult, maybe you can't even imagine this, but it's difficult to imagine, I suppose, where the regime is now. But if you've ever seen footage, actually, from the militants storming the American embassy and then taking the American diplomats hostage, the spokesperson for the revolutionary movement who sees the embassy is a woman. Right? There are women everywhere in this moment. And so it's not clear what the Islamist revolution is going to be, where there are women participating even in the Islamist half, if you will, of the Iranian Revolution. So there's something interesting there about, does Foucault support it in Iran? It's not clear, but they really don't talk to one another anymore after that. All of this actually brought Deleuze to note something, and that was, and maybe this will tie back to the book, but that is the rise of marketing seemed to represent something profoundly different in terms of recognizing trends in philosophy. And that is, the challenge of the time, Deleuze sees, is that marketing becomes actually the description of a thing over and separate from the thing itself. And this, from structural terms, right, it disconnects what seemingly in semiotics was undisconnectable, if I could make up that word, that somehow there's a disconnection then between the signifier and the signified. That the signifier of marketing and advertising over the thing itself, the signified, they no longer have a relationship. And that somehow the signifier itself becomes its own thing. This is a radical transformation. We'll come back to this in just a little bit. Right. So let's talk about the book then. And I think in many regards we can think of this as the possibility of psychoanalysis as an anti-productive activity. And what do they mean by that, or what do I mean by that? Well, in this regard, the breaking all activities as being somehow in the name of production and consumption. That psychoanalysis itself can be this space of reflection this potential for self-emancipation, and then doing it with someone else, not just doing it for yourself, but doing it together to actually then assist someone else in their emancipation, and that someone else can assist me in my emancipation. And that this joint effort has nothing to do with the productive economy, right? This has to do with self-emancipation, self-improvement. And I think some of that gets captured in Foucault's introduction to the book, where he talks about just how important this book is, that he says, 5 brief, impassionate, jubilant, energetic years, right? The powers that be have suffered incredible blows. First and foremost, in Vietnam, right, the powers that be, a colonial power, is faced, right, with the potential that it could be overthrown, right? That the order of the colonialists could be undone in Vietnam. And I think this is also an important recognition, right? That seeing the way, particularly that the Viet Cong were fighting the Americans. Yes, there's Ho Chi Minh as the leader of the party in North Vietnam, but he himself, right, doesn't dictate what this revolution is going to look like in South Vietnam. And the idea that the Viet Cong, with the support and at the direction of the North Vietnamese, they are kind of doing it for themselves as well. And so there really is this hope, right, for amongst radicals that the Viet Cong can realize the revolution. And basically, Foucault suggests that there are kind of 2 fronts that the powers that be are being challenged. That we can see a way forward by challenging the establishment about challenging social exploitation. We can think of that in terms of production, and psychic repression. And that these 2 things go together. I want to say something more about that in just a moment. But Foucault suggests that there are 3 enemies to the potential of this revolution. And I really like the first one. The first enemy of the potential of the revolution are political ascetics, what Foucault calls sad militants. He calls them the terrorists of theory, the bureaucrats of the revolution. He says, the revolution can be fun. You don't have to be so damn serious about it. And moreover, you don't have to be so sad when this is about the potential for emancipation. Seeing this, I think, is also a reflection, not that Foucault does this, but I think for Deleuze in particular, and for Guattari, for Guattari in particular, and Deleuze as well. This goes to the heart of Lacan's psychoanalysis, which is looking at the role of jouissance in the realization of the potential of a person. Jouissance as a realization of pleasure. It doesn't translate very well into English because it's simultaneously like joy and pleasure, satisfaction, but it also has a very important connection to release in the sense of a sexual orgasm. And so this kind of more than joy, kind of orgasmic pleasure, but it's also about this kind of release of tension as this orgasmic pleasure. And this idea then of trying to find jouissance in one's own activities basically is what Foucault is accusing these sad militants of not doing. They're not enjoining themselves into a pursuit of jouissance in the name of the revolution. Another enemy is the poor technicians of desire, according to Foucault. And these are psychoanalysts. Psychoanalysts and semioticians, that semiotics itself might actually be problematic, and that what the relationship is between the signifier and the signified, what the relationship is between desire and want, the idea of a false self or a true self, that psychoanalysts may actually be as guilty as the sad militants in trying to defeat real introspection. And we'll come back to the point of this in a moment. And the major enemy, the third and most important enemy, is the enemy of fascism. And This, for Foucault, is not Hitler or Mussolini, but rather it's our own fascism. It's the fascism, according to Foucault, in our own heads. It is the fascism that comes about for the love of power. And the love of power, the desire to dominate, the desire to repress, that is fascism. And so, as Foucault ends the introduction, right, the Anti-Oedipus is, quote, an introduction to non-fascist life, and to think about how to defeat fascism, the fascism in our head. And this becomes a theme that goes on. Guattari wrote another essay, Everybody Wants to be a Fascist, and it is about exploring this desire to repress and other, and to think about how can we be open and generous to the other, not be so repressive of the other. So perhaps, well, I'll just do this quickly, but you can read it for yourself, obviously. But Foucault then even has a list about how to realize this life that's free from fascism. And the idea here is to believe that what is productive is nomadic and not sedentary. I think is really quite important to move, to take in new experiences, to not be grounded down. And just think about your own kind of experience in the 4 years of IR here. You can imagine how many, unfortunately, of my colleagues, and I don't mean to speak ill of them, but how many of my colleagues demand that you actually choose a theoretical perspective from which to address something. And you really kind of choose it as you would choose a team, right? You're going to follow this theoretical perspective, and really you shouldn't deviate from it, as opposed to a different perspective, which would be to be theoretically promiscuous, to explore, to move about, to change your own mind, to join things together, to see how they fit, right? To really be nomadic in one's thinking. And this is what Deleuze and Guattari mean by that. To not be the sad militant, even though what we're fighting is abominable, to not use thought to ground political practice in truth, but rather to use political practice as a way to intensify thought. Right? To see, as Marx has always suggested, right, that theory and practice are linked together in a kind of praxis, but to really see how both influence the other, and one isn't dominant over the other, and to think of those relationships. And then to try to think about how is it that the system makes us into individuals, to de-individualize, although this will be problematic. We'll talk about this in just a moment when we turn to Deleuze's notion of control society. I don't think that Foucault or Deleuze could imagine how we've been individuated, and that is that we aren't individuals anymore. We become our choices and our preferences, and we become just our DNA, or we become much less than a whole. And while they were talking about how to de-individualize, they meant that. They also meant it in a way of how to come together, not just to be smaller than an individual. Maybe we can talk more about that. And most importantly, Foucault finishes his list, and I think this is the message through the whole of Deleuze and Guattari's book: do not become enamored with power. So if we think about how this book really picks up from the question that Wilhelm Reich asks at the end of the Second World War in his philosophy within the Frankfurt School, how could the masses desire their own repression? To think about how was it possible for fascism to take hold? And Deleuze and Guattari argue, it's interesting that the English and the Americans, they really don't like this question, right? Because fascism happened over there, right? Fascism is an Italian and it's a German problem, or maybe it's a Spanish problem, or maybe it's a Hungarian problem, or maybe it's a Greek problem. But it's not our problem. And Deleuze and Guattari, I think, being French and knowing that there's this whole myth that grows up in the 1950s, and it basically continues into the 1990s, that everybody was in the resistance, right? That there were no French fascists. They know, Deleuze and Guattari, they know that there were so many French fascists, and they also experience in the present, they are present, but one could argue the continued present, Macron's present, there remain fascist elements and tendencies within France. How is it that people desire fascism? They desire the repression of the other, but in desiring the repression of the other, they too become repressed. And in a sense, how is it that they desire their own repression? And like Marx, right, that we read so long ago in week 2, like Marx in his introduction to the Grundrisse, where, or as we've discussed, Marx suggests that you can't separate politics from the economy, right? That's what liberals want you to do, to think that politics happen over here and the economy happens over here, and they don't have any influence on one another. We understand that's wholly untrue, but as Marx sees it, right, the base and the superstructure, right, they're joined together. And so you can't talk about the economy and politics separately, and that's why Marx writes about political economy. For Deleuze and Guattari, they want to take that even further and say, you can't separate the political economy from the libido. You can't separate, right, this kind of politics that happens out on the streets from the sexuality that happens, say, in the bedroom. And in fact, sexuality doesn't just happen in the bedroom. Sexuality happens on the streets. So if we understand that the economy, through marketing, through all kinds of different approaches to the politics of the day, to all kinds of social institutions, that structures sexuality, then there's no way that we can actually think about undoing, say, the political repression here without thinking about how there's repression within sexuality. And where does repression from sexuality come from? It comes from psychic repression. So we come back in a way to Freud and thinking of the relationship between sexual repression, right, as a way of controlling behavior, as a way of controlling bodies. In Deleuze and Guattari's case, right, that sexual repression, right, isn't just, the Oedipal complex. It isn't just the law, although we'll come back to this. Right? But for Deleuze and Guattari, it's to see the connection between the agent of that repression as being capitalism. Capitalism is shaping our psychic repression. So in the way that this book is probably as much about how the economy flows through bodies as it is about anything else. And how power flows through bodies is also something that Foucault is profoundly questioning, and something that he is equally profoundly interested in understanding. At the heart of this, right, Deleuze and Guattari suggest that if we're going to think about the mechanisms of capitalism's sexual repression, we have to think about what are those narratives, those master narratives that exist within Western society. And in a way, they want to examine Freud's Oedipal complex. It's the reason why this book is called Anti-Oedipus. It is to suggest a kind of politics that isn't all about self-centeredness, right? That if politics isn't all about me, but somehow about how I can engage the other, that it isn't all about me trying to repress the other, but trying to engage one another as an equal, then it has to be a politics that is not egoistic. And if it's not egoistic, then maybe what we can also be is not Oedipal. And so we'll come back to that. So in a way, this book is it can be understood almost as kind of Marx meets Nietzsche, kind of that way. Although I would say, unlike Nietzsche's, force, right? It's not a Superman. It's not an individual. It's not someone who's alone, who in their own reflexivity, right, comes to understand that they're not fettered by morals, and therefore they can transcend morals, as written in the genealogy of morals. But rather, this is, for Deleuze and Guattari, this is about collective action. This is a call for collective politics. So to forget the ego, to forget the self, right, this is to engage the group, and it's also to engage the other. So some of this language I understand is quite difficult, and I don't want to go through it too long because I don't want to make things more complicated rather than to make them to explore them and to explain them. But I do think that some of this is important to to understand. And so to suggest that for Deleuze and Guattari, right, there's no distinction between man and nature, right, humans and nature. Like there's no distinction between the political economy and the libido, like there's no separation between politics and the economy. Humans and nature, they're one and the same. And we can see this then in Guattari's later work. To become that separate thing, there is then a whole question about desire. And thinking about what they write as desiring machines, and also the body without organs, there's a conflict between these two. And to understand what are the desiring machines and what is the body without organs, we can somehow see this as being the relationship between labor and capital. That in many regards, capital is the body without organs of the capitalist being, right? It is that in the productive process, right, in the economy, it looks like capital, right, is what makes value. But Deleuze and Guattari actually argue, no, it's quite the contrary, right? It's that labor makes value. Labor makes everything. It's not the capital, it's the labor. And in a way, labor is responsible for production, not capital. And moreover, it's labor that produces surplus value. And in that sense, they're the ones that make everything, but the body without organs, capital, it's it that controls production. So what we have is the unproductive, unconsumable body without organs, just this shell, right? This shell of a thing that labor is making everything for, and yet this empty vessel is what is controlling all this. And now Marx, of course, observed this early on, right? That it's always funny, right? What are we supposed to do about people who don't work? Who doesn't work? Capitalists don't work, right? Capitalists are the ones that just take, right? They just take surplus value from asymmetrical labor contracts. They just take resources from the state. It is capital, right, that is unproductive. Labor, on the other hand, is far more productive, right? And so this relationship between capital and labor, it's often seen as mystical, but it's not, right? It's that labor is creating all of this wealth. And so how can we overcome this contradiction? And that is to explore then desire for Deleuze and Guattari. That the libido is the connection to labor, right? It is connective labor. It is desiring in production. And basically it is this that kind of forms, for Deleuze and Guattari, it's what forms the binary linear system. The schizoid, on the other hand, it's what scrambles codes, right? It breaks systems. It breaks the binary. And so thinking about how do we disrupt things. Now it's curious, again, to think about how capitalism consumes stuff and adapts it, right? To think it's Mark Zuckerberg, right, who talks about running around and breaking things. I mean, it's Donald Trump who actually talks about smashing things, move fast and break things, right? That was the slogan at Facebook. The idea here is similar, but it is in the aim of creating self-emancipation, not creating capital. But thinking about how to scramble codes and all those kinds of things, part of what Deleuze and Guattari are suggesting, one of the ways that we can learn how to scramble codes is actually to learn how to scramble what we're told should be the functioning of our libido. That by trying to break what it is that we desire sexually becomes a way for us to understand desire more directly. And so for Deleuze and Guattari, just to repeat this, social repression is psychic repression. The two can't be separated. The two are linked together. And the relationship between social repression and psychic repression is then the relationship of sexual repression. And they suggest that it's the Oedipal complex itself, right, as taught by Freud, that is the source of psychic repression. That is what would happen, right, if the law prohibits something, and then we're told that that thing that's prohibited is what we actually desire, but we can't have it. So I didn't know I wanted this, but I'm told that I want it, but I'm told that I can't have it simultaneously. This is a very interesting kind of move here, which is to create something and then its denial then also becomes the thing that suggests that that really is why I desire it. It has to be denied because I desire it so much. I didn't know I desired it, but now when I'm told that I can't have it, I'm told that I can't have it because I desire it so much. In a way, this becomes an important kind of fiction. Right? We did not desire it, the Oedipal complex. Right? The young boys did not have sexual ideas about their mothers, but we're told that we did. And that's the fiction, according to Deleuze and Guattari. Why is that important? Well, here, this is like advertising. Right? It's the power of repression to displace our real desire. And in this regard, we actually see the elimination of our real desire to fit the law. Right? So to them, repression cannot exist. It cannot act without some kind of displacement. And in a way, the Oedipal complex, the Oedipus, it's not a state of desires. It's an idea that repression inspires in the sense by telling us that that is the source of all of our desire. It is what Deleuze and Guattari call bait. It simply is bait. It is the singular desire to destroy my particular desire. So think of it this way, right? It becomes a way to tell everyone that they have the same desire as a mechanism by which to destroy any possibility for me to realize my own desire. And me realizing my own desire is not egotistical in this form, but rather it is experiential, right? It's about me being free enough to try to figure out what it is that I want. And so to think of the way that real desire would actually then break social forms, right? The real desire could actually be incredibly liberating. It could be also incredibly destructive to the establishment. I want something different than what I'm told that I want. I don't want what I'm being told that I want. And as such, it becomes a way, right, for me, if I could realize it, for me to think about all of the mechanisms of repression. In this sense, it's more than just the proletariat being fooled, right, by being told that they want this desire. It is about retraining how we think. And this, I think, is an important connection to Foucault, right? That the Foucauldian perspective on rendering bodies docile is the idea of regularization and practice, right, and repetition. So Deleuze and Guattari also pick up this on particularly Deleuze on repetition. Doing something over and over and over again, right, forced to do it over and over again, regularizes it to the point where you don't think about it. So the idea that we always go to school from 8 to 3 makes it much easier to go to work from 9 to 5, and we don't think about giving up those time periods, right, because our bodies have been so regularized to that kind of practice. And so to think about how the psychic repression functions, it becomes very difficult to see it, right? Because it's actually happening unconsciously. It's its unconscious nature of this psychic repression that actually distinguishes it from the social repression, but in many regards makes it even more insidious, right? Because it changes how we think. It changes even what's possible in terms of desire. So basically, the repressive social formation delegates its power to an agent of psychic repression. And in this, we might think about repressed desire as masked by then a fake displaced image. So we have this displacement. So to be frustrated and not being able to understand how I should desire or can desire, right? I then understand that frustration is actually my frustration of not being able to have my mother. By it's the frustration that is the sublimation that's in the center of the Oedipal complex. And so I'm suddenly told that the reason why I am what I am, right? The reason why I'm so frustrated, the reason why, I'm sorry, I just lost my own screen here. Sorry, everyone. Sorry, there I am. I'm sorry about that. Let's start that again. So the reason why I am the way I am, the frustration, which is actually the frustration of not being able to realize what it is that I truly desire. I'm told that my frustration is actually because I desire something understood through the Oedipal complex or the Electra complex, and therefore I don't question my frustration. I accept my frustration as being part of this dictated to psychic repression, and as such, not only do I accept that sublimation, but I also think that it's necessary, right? I actually think, oh my goodness, I better accept that sublimation. Otherwise, I'm going to do this thing that is just so incredibly taboo that is just completely unacceptable. And in this sense, we can actually think of the agent here of that psychic repression as being the structure of the family itself. That the idea of the nuclear family, right, makes more intense the immediacy of, say, the incest taboo. And as such, right, we can think of the way that the nuclear family itself is its own form of social repression, right? Why should we be so attached this way? You know, there are plenty of people who don't like their siblings, and plenty of people who really can't stand their parents, and plenty of parents who actually really can't stand their children, right? That why is that the unit? What would happen if we lived other ways? And there are other ways to live, in other societies, past and present, have lived differently, and we can imagine living differently in the future. And we can see it's that structure of the nuclear family that is its own form of social repression. And part of the necessity then of that structure is to suggest that at the heart of that structure is desire. Now, I mean, in this sense, you can think of incestuous desires, right, as the disfigured images of repression. And so, you know, I'm told that I shouldn't have those thoughts, so I repress those thoughts. And by doing that, right, I'm repressing critical investigations of all kinds of other things. Perhaps I'm being cheeky here, so forgive me, but it is worth noting, right, that in terms of last week's conversation, in terms of radical desublimation, if we think about the explosion of the porn industry as a form of radical desublimation, right? That pornography was seen as, you know, completely socially unacceptable. The idea, right, that we started this lecture with, that Guattari would actually be found guilty of committing, right, an offense of public outrage to public decency by even talking about homosexuality, let alone, right, the common consumption of pornographic images all across the internet. It is worth noting, I mean, what are some of the top categories that those kind of infamous places like Pornhub is incestuous porn? I mean, so brother-sister sibling video, you know, mother-sons, father-daughter. I mean, all these categories, right, in a way, this is precisely what Marcuse describes as radical desublimation. Now, suddenly, right, you have all this taboo material, this previously taboo material available, but what is it really about? It's really about a lot of money. right? It's really about a huge, huge industry, I think would be um, Marcuse's take on it. What's curious here is what does that do actually to um, uh, Deleuze and Guattari's argument? You might actually think that one of the reasons why that's actually such a popular set of categories on these pornography distribution sites is because we're told that that's actually what we want to see, because that's the thing we're not supposed to have, and that really disfigures then our ability to figure out what it is that we really want, right? That desire itself becomes shamed, and as a way it asks, is this what you really want? I mean, is this what you really, really want? And in a way, the edible complex is made by capitalism to control desire, according to Deleuze and Guattari. That by controlling my desire, I'm controlled. And to think about how to escape that, right, is of incredible potential. And I think in some regard, this is the Floyd piece, right? In thinking about the relationship between consumerism and homosexuality. I think the same is true. What had been seen as a kind of liberating potentiality just becomes, as I said earlier, normalized through heteronormative behaviors that are linked to consumption, right? That are linked to capitalism. So if we think about the turn now to the organless body, to think about this concept, right? Part of this is thinking about us as desiring machines, right? That if we think about how organs are connected to power sources, that once they're plugged into flow, that the organs comprise even larger, more complex machines. And we can think about how we are made by capitalism, made into desiring machines, how we actually are plugged into all these systems of desire and being told that this is what we want, and being told this is how we can have it without us figuring it out for ourselves. And therefore we become mass consumers. And in our process of consuming, right, thinking that we're realizing our desire, according to Deleuze and Guattari, all we're doing is making capitalism richer and repressing ourselves even further. Right? So how can we think of, say, the move here away from being trapped in this factory of desire and trying to move into other spaces? And for Guattari then in particular, right, it's the move then to psychoanalysis that becomes the way that we can start to think about and reflect upon our desires, our experiences, our wants, our motivations. And in a way, right, this goes to, and we'll do this much more through Ella's piece, but this goes to Lynn Layton's article about the divided subject, right? I mean, what divides for Lynn, right, are those adult pressures for conformity, particularly shame and humiliation, right? Shaming and humiliating as a form of dominance, forcing people into conformity, right? And Ella's going to describe that as kind of boarding school syndrome. So I'll leave that for Ella to do. But if we think about those pressures, right, to make sure that we desire the correct things and to shame us if we want something else, right? This is important. And yet Guattari thinks, well, what happens if we turn to psychoanalysis as a space in which we can explore these things without shame? And I think this is a key idea, right? That the clinical space in particular, whether it's in the analyst's office or it's in the board, is a place without shame, right? It is a place without embarrassment. It is a place to explore what are understood as dark thoughts, but maybe dark thoughts, according to Deleuze and Guattari, maybe dark thoughts aren't that dark. We're just told that they're dark. Now, again, I want to be clear, right? They're not suggesting that schizophrenia is something desirable, right? They're not suggesting that the schizophrenic isn't sick, and they certainly are not suggesting that, say, murder is not a dark thought, right? They hold all that, but they are trying to suggest what happens if we think differently. And to this regard, thinking about how psychoanalysis can be an anti-productive activity, particularly if it's polyphonic, right, polyvocal, to think of this as a social process by which all of us together start to break down things. And it's interesting to think about, say, how for a while there was even the idea that schizophrenia could become a process. This idea that there could be a drug-induced schizophrenia, thinking about what LSD would do as a way of disrupting patterns, as a way of freeing thought. And it is interesting to, even with all the kind of things that went really quite ugly wrong with some of the LSD experiments, particularly giving people out, as the CIA did, giving people LSD and not telling them that they had just taken LSD, and therefore didn't know that what they were seeing were hallucinations, thinking that they were actually real, and then people throwing themselves out of windows. And you probably know the stories. But it is interesting to think about now even how psychedelic drugs are even being used presently, especially to counter PTSD, as a way of freeing people from these inhibitions about being able to think about things. In the case of utilizing mescal and magic mushrooms, or whatever you want to call them, in treating PTSD, it is a way of kind of creating a distance for the sufferer to be able to engage those thoughts without experiencing the trauma. And here it's interesting to think about, the way that LSD would allow someone to see things that the connections aren't there, but what would happen if they were? I mean, what happens if the wall does melt? What happens if you think you can put your hand through the wall? What would you feel? And in that sense, we can see how what is different, right? How to think about how dislocating associations, dislocating, fragmenting, fracturing. This is actually what Eugene Bleuler thought of when coining the term schizophrenia in 1911, right? Thinking about how to change associations, and that the schizophrenic, right, has unsettled associations. And in a way, this is also even what Klein means by calling it the paranoid schizoid position, right? The schizoidness of it, right, is that those associations are dislocated, right? To not be able to connect, right, the bad breast and the good breast, right? To not see that as the mother, to separate them as two distinct things, right, is partially by not being, in this case, by not being capable yet of acknowledging that the good and the bad are in the same body. What happens when we break these things? Amy Schumer, right, the comedian, talks about her autistic husband, and that his autism, right, is maybe the same way that Greta Thunberg speaks of her autism as a kind of superpower, because it allows for these kind of dislocations in a way that not everyone can engage. So to think about the way that we even speak, right? How we make those associations. Deleuze and Guattari are suggesting we need to break them. And they do that then by talking about the organless body, the body without organs. And that is, right, the body without organs, eyes shut, nostrils plugged, anus blocked, stomach rotten, throat ripped out, right? They suggest, right, that the body without organs is, no mouth, no tongue, no teeth, no throat, no esophagus, no stomach, no intestines, no anus, just, right, this mass, right? And in a way, right, the body without organs is trying to attract organs, right? And this is the tension of the two states of one that is connected to all machines, and the other state as the catatonic stasis of the body without organs. And these two, right, are kind of in a tension. And in a way, to think about schizophrenia as a process, to think of things differently, is a way of trying to overcome these two processes, right? To overcome these two states. How, right, do we become conscious of those forms of oppression? And here, right, Deleuze and Guattari are suggesting that we have to transcend even what Marx was talking about when suggesting that we have to become conscious. It's not merely enough to become conscious of the forms of repression that exist within the economy. Right? Here, it's not just to become conscious of the forms of repression that exist within false desires or false needs. It's not just becoming conscious of the mechanisms of reification, right, that renders a relationship into an object, that transforms what should be a social exchange into an exchange that's transactional, that requires both sides of the transaction to treat the other as an object rather than as a knowing subject. How can we get to the point where we are more conscious of how to see each other as knowing subjects? Part of this is then also seeing what are the forms of psychic repression that make us desire our own repression. And that, for Deleuze and Guattari, is the mechanism, right, of capitalism. Now, like those mechanisms, right, how we think, we can turn to Bourdieu, and again, this is, Kai's going to talk about this, so I'll leave some of this actually for Kai's thought piece. But if we think about symbolic power, right, as being another form of unconscious power, by thinking about how the way that we conceive of a subject becomes the way that we may end up treating that subject. And moreover, if we're kind of taught again and again through these symbolic power exercises that someone else is not a subject, but that someone else is actually an object, right? How do we transform the subject into an object? Through these mechanisms of symbolic power. And one could say that that step is a form of repression. In fact, I write elsewhere, I don't think I assigned this piece at all, but that the very, very first act, or the most fundamental act of violence, is the denial of someone else's subjectivity. But the first act of seeing someone else as an object is an act of violence. And we can tie this then back to sexuality. If we think of an other as a sexual object, right, to think of my own pleasure only vis-a-vis the potential of that body, right? But it's the potential of that body not as a subject, but the potential of that body as only an object, or as only the object of my gratification and my pleasure. That's violence, right? That's a form of sexual violence unto itself, by not recognizing, right, the subjectivity, the participation, the experience of the other, right? And not just in a singular act of consent to ask at the beginning, but continuous response of recognizing the other as an equal subject who, you know, is having equally important experiences, and to not place my satisfaction, my gratification over the other. Right? That placement of my immediate needs or my gratification over the other, that's another form of objectification. And that, in my estimation, is a primary form of violence. So we'll talk about Bourdieu and how then we can think of the mechanisms of symbolic power, and the way that reality then is made through power. But I would just say, as a connection then to Deleuze and Guattari, thinking of how reality doesn't exist out there, right? But that it exists in this Kleinian fashion, where neither Bourdieu nor Deleuze and Guattari actually cite Klein. But if we think of it in this Kleinian way, how we are led to think about the outside world, about the external world, is then partially how we expect the external world to be. And in a way, we project that expectation and make it so. And then if we project this expectation and we experience that expectation as a feedback, then it suddenly strengthens the reality of that. And for us to think about how reality is made through this symbolic power. Power makes reality. It doesn't exist in its own right. And we can then think of how we trouble reality. Now, unfortunately, all of this good lefty emancipatory questioning of reality has now led us to this condition where someone like Donald Trump or many among his staff can talk about alternative facts. Right? They can say that I can't remember who actually said it, as a staff member in the Bush administration said with regards to the Iraq War, we make our own reality. And I mean, this is what Bourdieu is critiquing, that reality doesn't exist in its own right, that reality is made through power. And the powerful have come to realize that and actually then try to change how many of us experience the world. And they do that through symbolic power, through speech, through language, but also through sexual repression. And then I'll just want to say one last thing, say about this is then we can see this also in Deleuze's notion of control society, which transcends Foucault's idea of disciplinary society, whereby our bodies are rendered docile through examination and regularization, that beyond this kind of repetition inside the factory and the school and the asylum, Deleuze actually anticipates, writing in 1990, so far anticipating, the notion of what he calls control society, which is that the move to control tries to be even increasingly more subtle, right? To make it so it's increasingly difficult to recognize that one is actually being controlled. That he suggests that enclosures, right, they're molds, that enclosures shape things, but controls are modulations. That they can be intensified or decreased, right? That we're not enclosed, but we're in debt, right? We're in debt in the sense of containment beyond enclosure. That debt in the capitalist world means we don't have to be in a box. We don't have to be in jail. We don't have to be in a space. We are enclosed, right, by the fact that we can't experience all kinds of things because we might be in debt. And in this sense, thinking about how control society becomes a password, it becomes code. Can you speak the right code to be able to move through space? If you cannot speak the correct code, if you don't know the password, you don't get through. But you might not even know that there was a threshold to cross, right? Because you're so ignorant of the password, you didn't even realize that you were facing a barrier. And for Deleuze, this is the height of control society, that the barriers are invisible. And they are only present for those who can pass through them. They become aware of the barrier through the transcendence of the barrier. And as such, right, we actually see then this kind of movement. Right? So in a way, in disciplinary society, we can think of kind of the two poles, that is the signature and the number. We can think of the individual and the mass. We can think of that relationship between individual and mass in terms of conformity. In control society, it really is about having certain passwords. And as such, it's not about conformity to the mass. It's actually a kind of particularity here. And even more so, it might even be about controlling not only whole beings, but even individuating control, so that the control isn't about my body, but control is about my choices. And as such, perhaps the passwords and the code words are to prevent me from accessing other codes and other passwords. But it's not me, it's my choices. It's not me, it's my behavior. It's not me, it's my blood type. It's not me, it's my DNA. And as such, maybe it's my DNA that's being controlled. And who needs to control my DNA? Well, that's, in this case, it's not necessarily about big government or something like that, although we should talk about that in the age of coronavirus. But more often, who controls my DNA, it's largely, or who wants to control my DNA, it's large pharmaceutical companies. Right? It still is capital that wants to control, or wants, in this sense, control having access to, being able to make productive my DNA, being able to make profit on my DNA, being able to transform me through controlling my DNA. And as such, right, we can see then the expanse of capital to something beyond my body. It's actually now gone inside of my body. And I have become individuated, according to Deleuze, because I am not a whole person any longer. I am only these component parts that are what the forces of capitalism want. So we'll talk about desire. We'll talk about mechanisms of control. We'll talk about what divides the subject. But I think most importantly for tomorrow's seminar, we'll really talk about, say, these systems of repression, right, that put out of bounds the ability to reflect on my own desire and to think about the challenge of trying to explore what is my desire. How do I even go about that reflection? And perhaps then we can turn to a conversation about the role of psychoanalysis to facilitate that conversation. And beyond perhaps even just the analyst and the analysand having a two-way conversation, but to think about this collectively in the way that Deleuze and Guattari suggest in their book, and the way that Guattari practice in the board. Thank you. See you tomorrow.